Hello and welcome to Plant Pod. I'm Robert Romej. We've got Brian Hook and Makenna Ayres. How's everyone doing?
Doing well.
Yeah. Wow, jinx.
Sorry. Yeah.
You owe me a soda.
Let's see. It's about 100 and something degrees outside. How you guys dealing with the heat?
I'm loving it.
Yep, still loving it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If the air conditioning would work better, I'd love it.
Brian does not love it.
In the room we're in, we just turned on the AC,
hot,
so it's taken a little bit to come down. So if you can hear the sweat coming off of our faces, that's what it is, in case you're curious.
We're just doing a little reenactment of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's not blood yet. But
Not yet.
Oh, goodness.
Well, moving on, guys.
So we are now...
Our sweat is nothing compared to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I just want you to know that.
Yeah,
So,
that is true. That is true. Speaking
About ready to.
of gardens, and you're going to try to somehow bring this back into the kingdom framework.
I feel like we need to start over.
No,
No, it's
we're
good. Keep going. Keep going.
All right, so what we're at today is we are now doing the question and response episode for our Kingdom Framework series. And I just now realized that I said response. So the reason for that is because we are responding to your guys' questions. We don't know if we necessarily have the answer, but we have some responses and maybe some answers. So we're going to take some of the questions that you guys sent in, our listeners, and respond to them as best as we can. We may not get to all of the questions, so we're just going to put ourselves on a time limit here. And once we hit that time limit, we'll start ending the podcast. And if there's plenty of other questions to be talked about, we'll come back to them. If not, we'll definitely make sure that we keep them in mind for future episodes. So
Good questions, too, though.
there's some really good
Hats
questions
off
on
to
here.
people that ask questions.
Yes.
We
yes.
just have the best listeners.
We really do.
We really do. You guys are smart.
Yes. So thank you guys.
I'm stumped on a couple of them.
That's good. We're about
Two
to
of
find
them.
out.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pass on those.
Oh, okay.
The ones that I don't answer, I was stumped on.
All right, well, we're going to kick them off in no particular order. We just have them in here, so I'm going to read the first one. The question comes from a listener in Alabama. It says, if I am a planter who has moved to a new town with my family, would I not need to focus on how to be in society in order to make disciples? So I think that this question is based on how we said that KDSC, so Kingdom, Disciple, Society, Church, that the order is really important. And so his point is, disciple comes before society, but wouldn't I have to be a part of society in order to find disciples? So how would you respond to this question? Either one of you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, it's hard because, especially when you're in a new place, it feels kind of impossible not to engage in society because you don't know anyone. And so I think that's a bit of a struggle. But I think when we're talking about the order with disciple coming before society, I think the emphasis is on creating disciples, right? Being discipled, creating disciples, focusing on that. And when we're talking about society, it's kind of that reconciliation aspect that we talked about, right? Where you work, where you live, where you play. And so you may not necessarily be actively making disciples. You may never see the fruit of that in society, but you will, if you start with disciples, you'll have that core first. You'll have all of those people who are actively engaging in society where they work, live, and play, reconciling things to the Lord. So that's kind of just my first thought.
That is good.
Mm-hmm.
I think also, when we say KDSC, we're talking about the process of a missionary, a church planter. So the process is how you would plant. So if you were talking to a planter and he says, how do I do this? We're really doing it in a response to an American framework, which is always starting with the church first, and then you go from there. And so just defining things and helping church planners to know what the process is. But there is a kind of a caveat and some things that are obvious to at least planters, or at least it should be made obvious. And I'm glad that you gave the question because I think it's important to discuss it, because sometimes if you just assume it, people don't really talk about it. We're assuming that you've been sent out from a church. So you could make a case that you're starting with church, So not really, because we're talking about the process of the planter himself. Like when they start, that's a couple or single person that's planting a church. You start with the kingdom first. And obviously your church is sending you out and you come into a city. Let's focus on the kingdom. What is God doing? And the disciple, at least in the process, is me and whoever I've been sent with. So a church should never send somebody by themselves. Even if you're unmarried, there should be somebody with you, another man that's with you in the process of being sent out, or a couple that's being sent out. There should be two people. That's how Jesus did it. So he was the king. He sent his disciples out. They were disciples, and then they sent them out into a city. But and then the church is planted. But I do think that you obviously need to know where Walmart is. You need to know the environment. You need to study your city. You need to know what's going on in your city even before you get there.
Yeah, that's helpful. In a way, what I hear is you take this as an individual or individuals, because you're being sent out by two. So those two, they're seeking the kingdom together.
Yeah.
And when we think about church planting, we're thinking about already having a body. But right now, you're the
You're
body.
it.
You're the body. So you are the disciple. And so as the disciple, you are going to be in a neighborhood and go to the Walmart that you mentioned, and you're going to be going to whatever gym. So you're going out into, so you're already living this out before you get to having more disciples. Then they just repeat and mimic you, what you're doing.
Yes.
I think the biggest part because I remember thinking the same thing when we were actually coming in to record that episode on discipleship, I think it was like, well, how come society doesn't come after? And I was like, well, you really want your body to be on mission to go out into the places where they work, live, and play.
Right.
And so if you have that ahead of time, you don't have them on mission, right? Because they're leaving their place to come and be a disciple. But you want them to be a disciple and then go out.
Right.
So that's helpful.
Yeah, because I think you see kind of the maybe unhealthy side of that. If you're starting with society and you're putting all of these events, right? Like these outreach events, there's lots of people coming to your church, maybe like hundreds of people every week, but there's not like a sticking point if that's what you're starting with is those events and kind of reaching society in that way. If your body doesn't know how to make disciples, like there's nothing that's going to make them stick, because if they came for the event, they're going to stay for the event. And when you stop putting on events, there's nothing keeping them there anymore. But if you start with discipleship, relationships are really what make people stay. When Christ-centered relationships are what make a difference for people. And so starting with that, and then if you happen to want to put on an event, I think it's a lot more successful, like the return, because people have already made those relationships. They're caring about one another. They're carrying out the one another verses, as opposed to all of these people coming in who don't know each other. And then they're like, I could give or take the next week.
Yeah, no, that's
I
good.
really like the question too, because it emphasizes the reality, which we should not assume, and that is that you are a disciple. And so we're assuming something, and we should never do that. Are you a disciple or not? Like, have you died to yourself? Have you laid everything before the Lord? Are you willing to do whatever he tells you to do? And then the person with you also is that as well. So we're assuming that. So kingdom disciple, I would say that before you go into a city, you better reconcile that in your own heart.
Yeah.
Like if that's not there, don't go into the city. So Jesus didn't send people that were, potential disciples. He sent disciples because he knew that he was going to send them as lambs unto wolves.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So be sure. Cool. Well, let's move on to the next one. McKenna, I'll have you read the next one.
Sure. This is from a listener here in Tucson, and it says, how can a church planner get their sending church on board with putting kingdom first and getting past the pressure to launch and reach sustainability? It's a really good question. What do you guys think?
That's a good question. That's one of those that I was stumped on. No,
Brian's like,
Brian,
I've got some ideas.
Can you speak to, before we even get
Yeah.
to that, like, so I think what this person is getting at is that sometimes churches, if they're sending someone out to plant, they might put some requirements on, right?
Yeah, I think
Or
that
organizations
it may be
that
good to
help.
define some things before we go on. Just for our listeners, a sending church would be a church that's literally sending the person out from their church. Maybe it's a member of their church or somebody that they're working with. They're willing to hold the ropes for this couple to send them out to plant a church. And so when that happens, sometimes there's some things I think the church is expecting, and I think there's some things that the planters are expecting from that sending church. And I think, right up front, I think it's important that the sending church knows what the vision is that the planters have. And then some churches actually have a vision and direction of their own before they even send somebody out. And that needs to be communicated. And there has to be an agreement there. So I think even an agreement, and I think a verbal agreement and then a written agreement of what's this vision and direction? What are we calling you to do? Or vice versa. Sometimes it's more of a passive role where the church is just saying, we're willing to give you some money and to send some people with you. You tell us what your vision is. That planter needs to tell the church. So either way, there needs to be an agreement of what's expected. Like, what's the vision, direction, and all that. And obviously there's room to change a little bit as you move forward, but what are you asking of me? And if there is a sending church that wants to be a sending church, but it conflicts with what God has told you as a planter, it's okay to tell the sending church, this isn't going to work. And I think you have to...
That's got to be so hard.
You got to be able to tell people that, though, because you don't want to be in a situation where 2-3 years in, they're expecting something and you're not delivering, based upon what was happening. You might be going to make disciples and it's going to take time and you don't have any people with you and they didn't send anybody with you. They didn't send very much money with you. It's going to be a slow journey to get this going. Took us 2 years before we even really started a worship service. And so they knew up front, this is what it's going to look like. I drove down with the senior pastor of Hope Church, Vance Pittman, and the executive pastor and said, this is what it looks like. This is where we're going to live. This is what we're going to be doing. It's going to take a while, so
a lot of communication
understood.
up front. Yeah.
They understood right up front what it's going to look like.
What I was picturing when I read this is here you want to, the person going to plant and wanting to plant, wants to plant with a kingdom mindset, but then maybe they've got a something put on them by their church of like, okay, in a year we want you to have 100 people, otherwise we're calling it quits, or whatever.
That does
right?
happen.
And that would be so hard because now it's like, well, now that's the focus. When I really just want, what if God's got 20 people for the first year or whatever?
I don't know if the person that asked the question had this in mind, but it's a great question because this happens so many times that the planter may have gone to a training or already had a kingdom mindset, yet the sending church has a church framework mindset. Therefore, the church framework mindset that has the money and the people and the decision-making potentially, they're the ones that are kind of the tail wagging the dog.
Call the shots.
And now the planter finds himself in a situation like you said to where now it's really worrisome and it causes tremendous anxiety.
And you're saying in some ways you just have to say no.
You just have to say no and be willing to go with that.
When I was reading this question, I pictured like a bride and a groom getting married, and maybe the bride's family, it's like, hey, we have this, sum of money for you, but if you accept it, we want X, Y, and Z at your wedding. And I know a lot of people that's happened to, and I feel like the advice is always like, if you don't want that, like, don't take the money.
Don't take the money.
Because if you do, like, you really are agreeing that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And then if you don't deliver that at the wedding, then that's just like a lot of unnecessary drama and hurt feelings and all of that stuff. So I feel like that's what I was like thinking of when you're having that conversation with your sending church, if these are their expectations and they're not budging on them, maybe like time to take a step back and think through some more things, pray through some more things.
I love the analogy of the wedding, because in a wedding, you have a bride and groom. Neither are wrong. It just depends on, is this what you're signing up for? And it doesn't take long before you realize neither the bride nor the groom signed up for what they got into. And you have to have a lot of grace there. So I would encourage all churches to have a lot of grace, planters have a lot of grace with your sending church. But talking through these are important. And I also want to flip it, because I don't want to assume that a sending church putting those requirements would be the ones doing that. Sometimes the planter comes at it from a church framework, and the church has a kingdom framework. So the planter may be out there doing some things like, we had X amount of people show up, we had X amount of staff members, we had X amount of dollars raised, we had X amount of, and then the church looks at it and they got a kingdom framework, and they're asking different questions. How many people have come to know Christ? How many have you baptized? Tell us about how many domains you are engaged in right now. What is your plan for church multiplication in the next 3 years? So they may have. So it's not always the church doing this. Sometimes planners will be like, man, I can't believe my church. They have they have such a church framework. Well, sometimes it's reversed.
Yeah.
And so the church and the planter have to come to an agreement of this is what's going on, and then move forward. And I think that, reaching sustainability is huge. What that means is you got enough money to make it. You're able to do this on your own.
You're on your own feet.
So there's some words in there that I was just trying to describe. Sending church, launch, that means typically a public service, which doesn't necessarily have to be. You don't have to have a public service first starting point where you kind of like, it's a big deal. We had that though. Sustainability means you don't need them anymore as far as their finances or people or anything, but hopefully they're always praying for you. So
That's good. Do you feel like we answered that?
I think
pretty
so.
well?
I think so. If not, they're not here, so we wouldn't know.
It's okay. They can always write back in.
Actually,
More
no.
questions.
We don't have callers, so that'd be kind of fun though sometimes.
Good.
Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Well, Brian, would you read our next question?
Is it the what a church planning team? What is
Yeah.
What does a church planning team look like from the start in a kingdom framework?
Ooh, I think I got this one from our conversation, and actually you just kind of touched on it on the first question, that it typically would start with at least 2 people. It doesn't, there are people who we even know of that have launched or gone into church planning, whatever you want to call it. They have gone to their new city, new location with a whole lot more people. But I think at a minimum 2, and in some ways that smaller amount of people, 2 or just a handful of people, can in some ways be better because you can all be just a little bit more on the same vision and same mindset from the get-go.
Yeah.
And the more people you have, you already are coming in with having to pastor those people and having to make sure that as the leader that we're caring for all of the people in that group. So in some ways, it is good to have small, but it's okay to have more. But just like you said in the very first question, at least 2.
It's very organic, isn't it? I mean, I think you could almost give the same answer for a small group.
Yeah, absolutely. You're
You know?
absolutely right. I mean, like we've talked about before, the small groups within our church, and I think within church in general, really are mimicking the church.
Right.
So like the way that our small groups would multiply and to have more small groups is the same way that our church would multiply if we were going to send out. There might be cases though where like I could definitely see a church that is multiplying and they send out maybe a leader, the husband and wife maybe, and also someone who would be great addition to help with the worship or something. So there might be more than 2, right? That makes sense. There's nothing wrong with that, with having more people.
Yeah, and something maybe we should probably talk about is, husband, wife going out. It was important for us too to have somebody else. So we met a couple here in Tucson we planted, and that was a goal, was to find somebody else before we even started a small group. And so when we found that other couple, that was 2, because a husband and wife aren't 2. Husband and wife are 1.
Or 1, yeah.
Yeah. So we had to find another couple.
It's
to be
almost
2.
like it reminds me of finding the person of peace. Going to the
Yeah.
city with your 2, and then find the
Yeah.
person of peace. You
Yeah.
found the person of peace. They actually then became part of what you guys were doing.
Yeah, and it's even how you engage domains. Like you do it in agreement. Like if you're 1 and you don't have somebody else in your domain, where you live, where you work, where you play, that is not a believer, the first step would be to lead them to Christ. And then you have 2. It sounds so basic, but that's how God works, because God's doing it, and He gives the instructions, and this is how He says it's done.
Yeah, that's good.
So
Is there any more on that one?
You definitely touched on like quantity, but perhaps they're asking
Ooh,
about quality.
That's
like
true. What does it look like?
What does the team actually look like?
Yeah, I was thinking what the team looks like in terms of numbers. So then how would that differ? What are
I'm
you
curious. I'm curious what you have to say, Brian. I don't have experience, but you do.
yeah, I think agreement would be huge. Like I think it's important that if they're going to start from a kingdom framework, they need to know what the kingdom is about. So they're kingdom citizens. They understand they're in agreement as well, how easy it is to have 2 people that see things totally different, and they get going and you realize, okay, you were thinking church, similar to what we talked about with ascending church. So I think it's important that team understands where we're headed. I can't tell you how many times I've had to explain to Jessica, certain aspects of church, and she's had to explain certain aspects of our family that we've talked about a million times. It's like, ooh, I didn't catch that. Like, and if we have problems with that, other people have problems with that. So you have to
Makes
make
a lot
sure
of
that you're
sense.
all on the same page. You're communicating on a regular basis. You're praying through it, that you understand what you're talking about. And I think, what does a church planting team look like? I think it could be that the person asking the question kind of wants to know more about what that could be outside of those two. So I think we're giving a very basic, organic answer. I think anything other than that, we're getting into types of churches.
Sure.
So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
I mean, we could kind of give an example of one, but I think you just don't want people to kind of think, okay, that's how you do it,
Right.
because then you're getting into like kind of a high impact church, or is it going to be more of a house church format or whatever? And they're, like we've said here, they're all good.
So really, what that makes me think of is it goes back to the very beginning, which is hear from God. And then what you've added to it, though, is go in agreement. So whoever you're going out with, make sure that you communicate really well. Do it on a regular basis, which reminds me of our small groups, too. Like, we're in this habit of we repeat our norms, our expectations on a regular basis. Why do we do that? So that way we just remind ourselves, like, what are we doing? Why are we meeting? Why are we planting? What are we? We're striving for multiplication.
This, as we're talking, it is so simple. You can always come back to, you started it, God didn't. And you can always come back to, you guys weren't in agreement. Those are if you can start an agreement and do what God told you to do, what he has initiated, and you're in agreement together, I will say this, it is a 100% success rate.
Wow.
People say, what is it, assessment? Is it training? What's the secret sauce? God. And if you're doing what God tells you to do, how do you fail? That's like it's a no-brainer. There's no secret sauce
That's
there.
true. Yeah,
That
you're
is
right.
God. Like, we're trying to figure out all these different routines and all those strategies. 99% of it is that, and then add the fog machine. I mean, like, what we do is we add the lighting and the fog and the preaching and the everything else and the money and the churches and all the trappings and missions and mission trips. And did God ever tell you to do that? Well, no, but this is what everybody's doing, and this is what the books say and all that. Just do what God tells you to do, and it may even look completely different than anything in your neighborhood or your city.
Which is what, like, just a moment ago when you were saying how, otherwise we're going to get into, is it a house church format? Is it this
Yes.
format? Like, God could very well be telling you, kind of like what we said in the episode when we were talking about some of this in the Kingdom Framework series, is it could be a leader who leads a boardroom meeting, and that is actually the start of a church plant.
Yeah.
And it's like, what? I've never heard of that. Exactly. That's what God
Yeah.
told him to do, or her to do, or them to do, right?
Amen.
Is whatever it is. And so they're just doing it.
Amen, Rob. I love that. That's true.
He loves it because he brought it back to what he said.
I'm telling you, there's a movement. There's a movement of God. If people that are listening, if there's even one of you that's listening, that is a business leader or somebody that's teacher or administrator, and you're thinking about just getting a group of people together in a boardroom or lunchroom or whatever, and starting a church, and you're wondering about permission and all that. If God is in it, He gave you permission. Get some people together in agreement, open up your Bibles, and you will succeed.
So
good.
God
That's
in
how
agreement.
movement starts. Movement cannot start based upon all the strategies.
That's good.
It has to be on God.
So in some way, there is a formula. The formula is God in agreement.
You
Which
can't
means
overstate
it's not really
that.
a formula,
You
but
can't- you can't
it
overstate
kind of
it.
is. Okay.
Put it on a bumper sticker.
Put it on a bumper sticker.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. We're moving on.
By
to
the
the
way,
next
can
one.
I?
Yeah,
can
please.
I take,
please.
we may not even get into the other stuff, but McKenna did a great job talking about marriage a while ago, and the importance of agreement there. I mean, that's what it is, right? Like, problems in marriage happen when you're not in agreement
It's true.
under God's authority. It's so simple, the marriage concept, the agreement with teams, the agreement with sending church and planter, everything that we're talking about here has the same template. So,
Well, since you bring that up, like a lot of times when I've even used marriage as the example in conversation as it relates to the body and people and stuff like that. And sometimes people have an issue with that because they're like, well, but it's not marriage. Like these are friends or these are our fellow Jesus followers. But the point is that marriage is one of the best examples for how we are to be in community with other people, right? Like it's an example. Like obviously I don't treat a good friend of mine the same way I treat my wife, but there are definitely things that overlap, so if I'm going on mission with my wife, I need to be in agreement. If I'm going on mission to plant a church with a friend and I'm a single guy, then I better be in agreement. It's the same. So the marriage is an example of what a community of Jesus followers is like in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
Yep. That's good.
So that is really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think with that agreement, since we're just being very basic, agreement means prayer. It's hearing God. So there has to be a lot of prayer, and there has to be a lot of reading the Bible, and there has to be a lot of prayer. So whether it's a marriage, whether it's your relationship with God, whether it's a church plant, whether it's a sending church and a church planter, there should be a lot of prayer and a lot of scripture. And if you don't see that, it's not God.
Yeah, not that you both agreed on this blueprint you drew up for your new city, but
Yes.
agreement from like what the Lord is actually speaking
That's
to
it.
you both. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
So it's God plus agreement. Yeah, like we said.
Because you can go anywhere in the world right now, and where you see church planting movements, you see the scripture and you see prayer and you see agreement.
Yeah, I think the agreement part, maybe not to go on too big of a side tangent, but just in general, that is huge. It would actually be interesting to even do some, like a dedicated podcast to something like that, because I don't think that it often gets the value that it
Yeah.
deserves.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That wasn't
Agreed.
purposeful. That wasn't purposeful.
I thought it was.
It wasn't.
That's pretty good.
Should I have said that it was? Maybe
Yeah,
that
you
would have been
should've.
cooler.
It would have been pretty cool. Agreed. I'm glad we all agree on that. Maybe we
I
don't
think
need to-
I think even if you're going, it's 3 years, 4 years down the road, and we have had issues even this week, and leadership and elders and talking through things, and even if there's you're not quite sure, you're reading the Bible and you're praying, and after a few hours, you're still going to have to make a decision. Sometimes agreement actually, even if you make the wrong decision, there's times when you're going to do it because you got to do something.
Yeah.
There's got to be something that you got to move forward in, and if you move forward in agreement, even if it's the wrong decision, I have found there's such power in that, because you're able to come back and go, "Wow, we blew it," and there's something really beautiful about that because you're going to do that a lot as a church planter.
That is.
But if you're by yourself, it's like I have nobody except me to blame. It's so fun to blame each other. But there's beauty in that. It's like, oh, you know what we thought. I mean, when they selected the disciples, after you got Judas, and they're like, it seemed right. Well, it didn't seem very. It seemed right.
It didn't sound super spiritual.
But
right?
they said, listen, I think this is it. Of course they prayed. Of course they sought the scripture, what they did. But at the end of the day, they weren't quite sure, but it seemed right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're talking about when they selected the new
New one,
Yeah.
And so it's like, it seems right.
It seems right.
Seems
to them
right.
to-
Yeah, it
that's
seems
good.
right. It's like, okay.
Well, they
Sometimes
picked
you
two
do that.
people and they cast lots,
Right.
didn't they? Yeah.
Right.
And we're not talking about, the Southern Baptist Convention getting together and going, seems right. But in a way, we kind of do that, right? We get to 16,000 friends of ours together and say, this is agreement, But we're not talking 16,000. We're talking 2 or 3, 4 or 5 people in a room. There's times when you just have to make a decision. And that agreement as a marriage, you do it all the time. Your kid is doing something crazy, and you just say, let's just make a decision and be the best parents we can be. And as a church planter, let's make a decision and be the best church planters we can be and move forward.
Yeah. I think that's both marriage advice as well as leadership advice, to remember that you make that decision in agreement. That doesn't mean that everyone, that was their first thought or something, but we make it in a united way. Therefore, if this does go wrong, we point the finger at all of us, not just one of us. Not the one who
We're
brought
all
it up.
we're all in this together.
And it's the same way in a marriage too. Like
Yeah.
it's not one spouse's fault because it didn't work out or whatever the plan was. Well, we did this together.
Yeah.
You know, we did this in agreement.
There's major decisions you'll make, but then there'll be some, hey, should we buy 4 speakers or 3 or 2? Let's buy 4. Okay, great.
Well,
Let's
shoot,
don't
2 of
kill
them went to
ourselves all
waste.
night on this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
let's just make some decisions and go with
Yeah,
it. Should we ever going to meet at 10:30 or 10? Let's do an agreement. And then that person says, I told you 10. No, you didn't. You said 10:30. You agreed with me. We're both wrong.
Yep.
You know,
We do
and you
this
can,
in
there's I think the beauty of it is not so much what the planning team does, it's how they do it. And that's the beauty of it,
Yeah.
you know.
One of the things that I have found as a helpful practice in my marriage that also goes into this is just anytime that something goes wrong, even whether it's my fault, it's always our fault. Even if it was like me or if it was my wife or something, like ultimately it was her decision, but we agreed on it, so it's not Carly's fault. It's we made the wrong choice.
It's for another day, but I would say even if you get ready to build a building, for instance, a big decision or building, getting land or everything, if you don't do it in agreement, you welcome people that are just really not interested. At worst, you've invited criticism into the conversation.
Yeah.
And so it's something that it breeds itself. If you could start with agreement and keep doing that, you will find those decisions to be just better decisions, and you have stakeholders rather than critics as you move forward.
Yeah. It's really good.
I like that.
Anything else that you guys want to add to those questions?
I don't think so.
No, I think we exhausted that little question.
That's good. It's a good
But-
question.
Yeah, but it was a good question.
That is a great question. Well, I'm going to read the next one. All right.
Okay.
The next one was also sent in here by someone here locally. It says, you guys often reference the New Testament passages when you talk about the kingdom framework in your podcast. How do we see the kingdom framework highlighted in the Old Testament?
Such a good
McKenna's got
question.
her Bible open.
I always got my Bible open.
Do you have something is there something that you could share from that Bible that would
Yeah.
help us? Do you really have something in there?
I do.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Do it.
no, I was just, as I was reading this
just saw it
question,
open.
I was thinking just about how in the Old Testament, God was always setting apart a people holy to himself. And we see that in like the Old Testament
That's
laws, right? All of the purpose of the laws, even though God gave them to the Israelites knowing that they would screw up, knowing that they
Yeah.
would never measure up, the purpose was to set them apart as a holy people. Well, why do you guys not eat pork? Or why do you only wear clothing of one fiber? Well, it set them apart, right? Because no one else was doing that. And they did screw up and they turned their back on God over and over and over and over again. And yet God always kept a remnant. He never took them out completely. He never just destroyed them. You see that with Abraham's descendants. You see it with the flood. Noah's family was saved. There's always a remnant. And so I just think about how it's always been through God's sovereignty and his plan to keep a people holy to themselves.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking, Brian, about how you talked about the reason we start with kingdom is because church will pass away.
Yeah.
Your church at some point will die, but there will always be a remnant. God's
Yeah.
people will never be completely taken
That's
off
good.
from the face of the earth. And so I think you kind of see that from Old to New Testament. Obviously, it's a little different, but you always see that God is setting apart a people for himself, holy to himself, that he's using to carry out his will on the earth, whether Old Testament or New Testament.
That's good.
Yeah, I agree that is really helpful because when you look at the Israelites, he's setting them apart to your point. And I love how, God tells us why he's doing it too. He's doing it to, he's setting them apart. And through those select people, he's going to save the many.
Right.
So through a few,
Right.
the Israelites, right, at the time in the Old Testament, he's going to save the rest of the world. So we sometimes forget that second part. And I feel like we just, God came to save the Israelites. For some reason, he favored them. No, he did that so that way the rest of the world would look at the Israelites and go, oh, I want to follow that God.
Right.
I want to be a part of that.
Right. And it wasn't because there was anything great about them. It
No.
actually says it was because they were weak.
Yeah.
God wanted to show his power through them
Yes.
because they were weak. And I think also maybe helpful to explain the opposite of holy is not unholy, it's common. So when we say like setting apart a people as holy, just means not the common people, not just your common folk that you see every day. And so it doesn't mean, you know, that the church is somehow better than these people, right? A believer is not in any way, shape, or form elevated to a standard of more worth than an unbeliever. We are all created in God's image. And so when God is setting apart us as holy, it's not to say like, all right, now these are like my super people, right? Like obviously we get different, we get favor from the Lord in different ways, but it's not tied to our worth before God. We just have a different role, and we get certain, I guess, benefits from that, but
That's
it's not
good.
like, you know, we're looking down on, these unholy people. No, it's just everybody was on that path, right?
Yeah.
When the Lord saved us, he didn't pick us because we were so much better in some way. Like we were all hellbound, and the Lord reached down and grabbed us out. So I think that's also maybe an important distinction to make.
Absolutely.
That's good. You know, I agree with everything that was said. I think that, you know, when you look at the kingdom, you see so many stories of people. I was just thinking of Daniel, you know, and we're talking about Jesus. You know, we have Jesus in the midst of the fiery furnace, right? And Daniel's like, you know, there's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the one that's in there is the one that looks like the son of the gods. Well, it did because it was, you know. Jesus is throughout the Old Testament, and Jesus is throughout the New Testament. And he makes appearances, doesn't he? You know, where he's there, but he's throughout. Like, and so to be a part of the kingdom is to be a part of joining the king of what he's doing. And Jesus is always moving throughout. And we see Hebrews 11, and we see all these men and women of faith that walked by faith. They didn't see it. And that's what happens when you're a church planter. You are engaging in things that you can't really see. You just know it's right. You know that God can be trusted, and that you are going to walk out and know that he is going to do what he said he's going to do. And, you know, from Abraham to Noah to Rahab to, I mean, the list goes on and on and on in that chapter of moving forward in faith. And so you see all those great people. I mean, you want to talk about walking by faith before you plant the church and before you see people showing up. Hebrews 11 is a great passage, you know, and sometimes the only people you have that are around you that are cheering for you are the great cloud of witnesses, you know, and it's okay.
Yeah.
And if you're a missionary somewhere and you don't have anybody around you that are believers, and you're just walking this out, walk by faith. And you have so much in common with Abraham, you know, and others in the Old Testament. So it's the same thing, right?
Yeah, it is. In fact, you know, when you look at so before Jesus and after Jesus, it is the same thing. It's the faith in Jesus Christ. That for them it was that there would be a Messiah to come, and for us it's that there was a Messiah. His name is Jesus, and he came. And so the faith is ultimately, what unites both. Yeah. I think, though, one of the things that comes to mind, this is just pointing out the difference of the Old Testament and New Testament, is there weren't church plants in the Old Testament.
Right.
Like, so there's the difference is that God was having the Israelites be the light, so to speak. You know, in Matthew chapter 5, God says, in the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So we, as we go and we plant churches, like, people are supposed to see that we are a light. They see our good works. We are set apart. We are made holy, right? So the church is that. Whereas in the Old Testament, before Jesus, that was the intent, was the Israelites were going to be that people.
Right.
And so he didn't use the word church. You know, there weren't like, we weren't having Kingdom Framework church planning podcasts in the Old Testament. But the reason is because he said, okay, I'm going to choose these people. And then we read the entire Old Testament where they failed and they failed and they failed and they failed. And so Jesus comes on the scene and changes it and says, this is actually open for anyone. But it's at the same time, it's very similar. Like, we as the church, I'm not saying that we are Israel, but we are the people set apart, to what you said, McKenna. I really like how you said that. So we're set apart not just for ourselves, just like Israel was not set apart for themselves, but it's for other people.
Yeah, that's so good.
You know, another thing that I think is we're talking through the Old Testament. Great question, by the way. I think that we have much more in common in a kingdom framework looking at those passages than we do in a church framework because, you know, Hebrews 12, you know, the next chapter, it talks about that all of these people that walked by faith in the Old Testament, they were a part of a kingdom that cannot be shaken. You know, they were committing themselves by faith to walk into things that were eternal things. And I think as a church planner, it's important to not only look at the New Testament, but the Old Testament and know that from the very beginning, we are walking by faith, doing what God has called us to do. And we may not get to see it. But we are part of an incredible kingdom. These people did not see it. They did not see the results of it. Some of them were cut in two. Some of them were burned. Some of them were, I mean, they were martyred for their faith. Whether, you know, we have some New Testament, early New Testament martyrs there, but also some Old Testament martyrs. You know, I don't think Noah was too popular, right? And so he was a part of something that was a kingdom that could not be shaken, you know, and we all have that in common. And so I think Old Testament does have some incredible stories, you know, about that. And they did not see it. And we as church planners may not ever see the results of what we're planning.
Yeah.
That's good.
Until we get to heaven. And even then we may not see it. And who cares?
Yeah.
Really. Because it's about Jesus.
No, that's good. This is a great question.
I had, if I can maybe close with this is what I actually had my Bible open to that I didn't read. But the prophet Micah in chapter 2, it says, down at verse 12, I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. He who opens the breach goes up before them. They break through and pass the gate, going out by it. Their king passes on before them, the Lord at their head. And I just really like that picture of just, I mean, for one, like the fact that they're called like a noisy multitude. I'm like, we're a rowdy bunch, aren't we? Like, church planters, but the church in general, of just, like to your point of just following God and doing what God says, even if it doesn't make sense. Like the Lord is at the head always. And that's the same from Old Testament to New Testament is we're trying to follow the Lord, follow his voice.
Can I say one last thing? And I don't want to be negative about the question because the question's so awesome.
Yeah.
Sure.
But one reason why I think also when we talk about the kingdom as it relates to church planning, let's face it, everything starts to make sense when we see Jesus. And so when we see Jesus here in the New Testament and we see his church, which for ages before had been hidden, what God was going to do through the church and the manifold wisdom, all that was hidden. So it's hidden, so it's hard to kind of pull things sometimes from the Old Testament. Let's face it, God allowed this Old Testament to happen to show us the need for Jesus. And, you know, there's thousands of years there that it's just a messed up scenario of God continually giving them one more chance, one more chance, one more chance, one more chance. What's he teaching us? He's teaching us your own ways and your own futile desire to walk through this and not walk by faith isn't going to work. And it's not going to give you any eternal rewards. Therefore, I'm going to give you a whole lot of books over a lot of years to show you this is how it works when you don't follow me.
Yeah.
And then Jesus finally says, let me show you how it works. So we don't necessarily focus a lot on the Old Testament because there's a lot of failure there. But you do begin to see some success. I mean, you see 1 or 2, 3. I mean, you got Hebrews 11. He covers a lot of them. And then you have, you have the church. And you have, and get this, even though we don't have it in books, and I don't believe it's canonized, you have the last 2,000 years of what's happened in the church, the testimonies of us.
Right.
And that's powerful as well. So Jesus and his coming really did change everything. That's why we talk so much about it.
Yeah. It's really good.
It's good.
Well, you know what? We have, there's some other questions on here that are really good. I don't know if it's worth an entire another episode. So one thing that we could do is sort of a speed round on the last 2 questions. We can kind of do that. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Totally.
I think that would be worth it. So McKenna,
Speed round. Go.
Would you ask the next question?
Yeah. Question says, something discussed in the KDSC episodes is the importance of domain. Over the past 5 years, there have been major shifts in social cohesion that have uprooted how people previously work/play. How can we, as a church body, continue to reach those who are withdrawn from the old normal, in quotations? Is this cultural shift to remote work going to change how we look at evangelism?
Good question.
That is a good question.
So I'm going to try to summarize it, and you guys can think of a response, or I can too. Essentially, like with everything, with COVID and everything else shifting us to be in our homes, be, remote work, probably watching a lot of online sermons, does that change? And if so, how we see Kingdom Framework and reaching people, reaching the lost, going out into society, all those things. I think that's essentially what this person's asking. What do you guys think? Brian, do you think there's a big change? Does it change much?
Yeah, I do. I don't know if I'm the person to ask, because I still haven't figured it all out as far as online and all that. I do know this: no matter what we face, whether it be, the increased at home, not going to work, working in, my house and all that, I think ultimately we still are engaged with people. And if not, we need to adapt our lifestyle to fit that.
Right.
So if your job is 8 hours of computer, you better fill in the other hours
of
your day or night with engaging with people. Because at the end of the day, I must take a job for a couple of reasons. But number one, I'm providing. I'm working so I can provide. Paul did that, right? Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, sometimes he found himself in scenarios where he had to be a tent maker. Therefore, he did that to go out and to share others. So even though he wasn't online and all that, the reality is he said, this is the job I have. Of course, he engaged with people while he was tent making. It was Paul, right? But we can do that as well. But let's face it, there are some jobs that just aren't, they just don't give you the opportunities to share your faith.
Yeah, you might be on your computer literally the whole day.
You literally may be working, just to pay for your food. Therefore, go ahead and change your day and your night to make sure that you're engaged with people and be intentional about those times.
Right.
I think there's two facets to this. One is, as the person that is the disciple looking to the lost, you can take it upon yourself that if you're the one that is stuck doing the remote work, what do I have to do now to reach probably my neighbors, because I'm not going into an office maybe or something, right? So I've got neighbors, I got people who I see when I go to the gym or whatever it is. So you have to be a little bit more creative, which I think is something that God is always calling us to do, is be creative with the thing that we're doing. Like be creative with how you engage with people. Then on the flip side, let's say that you maybe do get around, but you realize that most of your coworkers or the people are stuck in their home. So you're going to have to be creative on how to reach them too. Like your neighbors might be stuck in their home. You may never see them because they have DoorDash and they don't ever leave their house, right? Yeah. So what kind of things can you do to creatively pursue and love your neighbor, right? So
and to look at those opportunities, and also there may be choices that you make in your profession that allows you to be more evangelistic, more around people. And you look at it and you think, okay, $2,000 more, yet I'm by myself. Let's be creative and maybe take a pay cut to make sure the mission of God is on the forefront. So, if it's one or the other job, start asking questions that you should be asking, rather than where do I want to live, or what are the perks involved? You may want to say,
how much more money will I get?
Exactly. What are my opportunities for furthering the mission of God in this one versus really this one? So ask the right kind of questions, and that may put you in a position where you have much more of an opportunity in this season.
That's really good. So the only other thing that I think I want to add to this question, I know we said it was a speed round, but I think this is important too, is we have to realize that our culture and just everything in general is now going a lot more online. So as churches, we should make sure that our online presence, that whatever we do put online is just good quality, because that really matters to people. So I think as a church planner, I'm not saying that you have to make a bunch of, you don't have to be the next YouTube vlogger, but if you do put something on YouTube or something online, just probably make sure that it's good, because that is, oftentimes what most people, when they're going to look at a church, they're going to go on the website first. So if you've got a website, make sure you do a good job. That's all. You know?
Yeah. And I think, just to your point, Rob, about being creative, I think maybe a challenge to listeners, if you don't work remote and you don't have coworkers that work remote and this isn't really something you've come across and you're not like currently evangelizing, you should because the world is only going to become more and more online and remote. And so if you kind of have all those opportunities available to you currently without any of those like online barriers and you should probably learn how to do that now, because there will come a point when, you do have to get more creative. And if you don't have like that foundation of like, I have all of these people that are unbelievers that I can be evangelizing to, and you're not taking advantage of those opportunities, it's only become only become a lot harder.
You're right about that.
When you're faced with that. So
work with what you've been given right now. That's good. All right, next question. This is the last one. It says, how does the kingdom mindset help with hardships of being a church planter? All right, Brian, you are one who has helped others plant churches, and you're a church planter. So how does having this kingdom mindset help when hardships come?
I think that it helps in that it's about the king and not you. It's on God. It's not on you. I think that if you take a church mindset, church framework mindset, it is on you and people. And kingdom, it's more on Christ, and I let the results fall on him. And so I think when I go through hardships, I'm able to go to him, and I'm able to cast all my cares upon him. I'm able to know that the burdens that he gives me are easy and light, and it's full of rest, and I don't have to worry about those things. That's what the kingdom is. If I'm feeling burdens and I'm feeling anxiety and I'm feeling just overwhelmed, I know that I'm in the wrong framework. And so I think being on a kingdom mindset helps me to endure and sometimes not be happy, but full of joy, knowing I'm doing the right thing. And sometimes as a church planter, if you're in the wrong framework and you're doing the church framework, you may be happy one Sunday, but you lack the joy, and I think that I don't mind the hardships as much, when I'm going through the kingdom framework. I'll tell you what, a tough place to be is being in a church framework and having hardships.
Yeah.
And you just scratch your head and you're like, I don't know where to turn. And you find yourself looking at your quiet time and realizing you haven't talked to God in 2 weeks. You're preaching sermons about quiet time, and your team's not praying together. You're doing everything on your own power. Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. So hardships aren't really that hard if you're in a kingdom framework, because you're constantly reminded to cast it upon him. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
it reminds me of one of the previous questions where we were talking about like trying to reach sustainability and stuff like that. And if you're maybe the sending church doesn't have the same mindset. Well, in this case, like if you have a kingdom mindset, you might have to tell your church no. Like that's what came to my mind. Like, man, how hard is that to tell this church, like, I don't agree. We're not in agreement, so I'm not going to partner with you. Like that is hard. Like, let's face it. Like you're saying no to money, and you know that you need money or something like that, right? Or support or whatever it is. But at the same time, you're like, but if this is of God, and if I truly heard from God, then this is going to work.
It will prevail.
It's really not, it's going to prevail. So is it hard? Yes. But why is it hard? Because it just means I have to trust more in God. And did I really hear from him? I truly believe I did. So I'm going to keep moving forward.
Yeah, that's
a great question. Great question.
No, that's good. Yeah, I
think that
agreed.
I think also the term hardship, I think in each framework, whether it's kingdom framework or American church framework, I think those hardships are different. I think those things that are in the kingdom mindset that would be considered hardships in the church framework may not be hardships in the kingdom, and vice versa. Some things just aren't that hard. Like if you're in the kingdom and you may only have a certain number of people in your church service and you're doing the right thing and you're just listening to God and you're walking with the Lord, that's not a big deal. In the American church framework, that's an incredible hardship.
Yeah.
That's like, you're a failure.
Right.
You're a loser.
Yeah, that's not even something to consider.
You shouldn't even be in the ministry. You know what I mean? That's not really a hardship in the kingdom. So you need to ask yourself, okay, what's going on here? It's not that hard.
Yeah.
Like you're doing what God's told you to do.
You're measuring your success by a completely
The wrong
different
framework.
set of standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's what we have for today. We do have more questions. Like I said, we did not get to all of them, but thank you so much for sending in your questions. Couldn't obviously do this episode without you guys. So please, if you have any other questions, feel free to send them in on any of the topics that we do. And we'll continue to do some more episodes like this in the future. So thank you guys for today.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
That
You're
was
welcome.
that was unhinged.
You're welcome.